folks, Ron here. Special programming note. For the past several weeks, couple of months now, I've been dealing with mold allergies, mold spores in the air everywhere, and it's wreaking havoc on my sinuses and what have you. So you can hear it in my voice. I'm pretty sure you can hear it in my voice a little bit now. So my past couple of episodes, I've been dealing with this. I've been fighting through this, still trying to get content out, editing as best I can. There was a couple of sniffles in this episode that's about to release. But please bear with me. It's just that time of year for me. It's horrible. So I hope you folks have some patience. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Ron Talks Tabletop Podcast, a podcast where I talk about my favorite things, role-playing games, card games, and a little bit of something else. Today I have yet another special guest on the show. So special guest, who are you?
I am Professor Dungeon Master of Dungeon Craft. Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Rob.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. I know that you are a busy man with many different things going on, so it's an honor for me to have you here. For those folks who don't know, Professor Dungeon Master has a YouTube channel that is over 100,000 subscribers. It's been going on basically since the pandemic, and he has a lot of insights about, well, crafting, but also being a great Dungeon Master in Dungeons and Dragons and other sorts of RPGs. I thought it would be great to have him on and have a little conversation about all that kind of stuff and whatever else he wants to talk about. So, yeah. To really get started in this conversation, people probably want to know like what your background is in hobby gaming, how you got into RPGs and whatnot. So how did you get into hobby gaming?
So it was Christmas 1980 or 81. It was the day after Christmas. And I had a friend, Joey, who was an only child. So he got way more Christmas presents than I did. And he got a copy of the basic Tom Mulvey Dungeons & Dragons set. And he invited me over to have hot chocolate one evening and roll up some D&D characters. And I remember crunching over there on the snow. It was bitter cold. We enjoyed our hot chocolate, and we rolled up these characters. We didn't know what we were doing. He couldn't read the rules right. He is a couple of years older than me, but we're rolling up these characters with, instead of 3d6, a 20-sided die. And we spent a couple hours equipping these characters. You know, I said, well, when are we going to play this game? And he goes, well, we have to find a dungeon master. And he was never able to find one. And then I said, well, why don't you be the dungeon master? And he said, I tried, but I'm too lazy. I don't want to read the book. You could read the book. So he lent me his book so that I could read it and figure out the rules so we could all play. And when I read the book, I thought, this is the greatest thing of all time. And I went over there and I was like, we've got to play this. We've got to get together a group of kids and play this tomorrow. And he's like, that's something for a rainy day. He never played the game. He was my older friend. I was like kid sidekick with that crew, and I had to round up the younger kids in the neighborhood to actually play the game. And I had to be the dungeon master because no one else knew how. And that was how I got into role-playing games 40 years ago now. Maybe more. Yeah, it's like 40 some odd years ago.
So you were basically the dungeon master from the beginning.
I was. We rotated positions, and I found other kids that were dungeon master. However, you know, I just did it most. And then when I was in my late teens, we started getting into other games, and my friends all took turns being the game master and running different game systems. And so that's how we did that. That's got a lot of exposure to different games like Mech Warrior and Twilight 2000, James Bond 007, Top Secret, Call of Cthulhu, tons of games.
Cool. So something that you said, talking about your story, you said that you read it and you thought it was the greatest thing ever. Well, like, what caught your imagination?
It was so legendary, Dungeons & Dragons. Like, I had friends who were like younger and they played with their older brothers. And I would ask, like, you know, what's it like? And they're like, it's the greatest game of all time. And I'm like, oh, okay. What does the board look like? And they're like, there is no board. And I was like, well, how do you win? And he's like, you can't win. And I was like, I understood about level progression. I'm like, what's the highest level? And he goes, there's like 1 million levels. And it was like just too vast for me to imagine as a 10-year-old kid. And it wasn't until I read the game that I was like, oh, it's like a talking storytelling game. It's like playing with action figures, only they're miniature figures. And it hit me at a great transition because I was getting too old for the action figures. Essentially, Dungeons & Dragons is a way to play with action figures forever.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was just so magical. It was like nothing else like it. And I'd never seen it played. I'd only heard it in legend.
And then your older friend invited you over to make characters. And sounds like to me he had a plan for you to be a dungeon master from the get-go.
He never played the game. He never ended up playing it because like I had no authority because he was 2 years older, so he wasn't going to take let me be a master of anything. So yeah, he never actually played. But I met him years later. It turns out his daughter watches Dungeon Craft, so she plays and she's the dungeon master. And she watches my show.
That's a great full circle moment.
Yeah.
So, but okay, so since you ran into him and everything like that, so he never even went back to try it years later.
Nope. No. Yeah, he never did. And the joke with like my friends and I is if Joey had just read that book, maybe he'd be on YouTube and and going to conventions as a guest.
Yeah, so it's funny how all of that works out. Nothing happens by accident.
It seems that way.
So you started with the Move Cook basic set.
Yep.
Which is in many people's eyes, the gold standard for a certain style of gaming called Old School Renaissance, Old School Revival, OSR. Yep. For you, I mean, that was just D&D because you played throughout, right? You never really had any major break in gaming.
No, I played. I never stopped playing. Like all the people like, oh, I stopped once I got married and have kids. Nope. No.
Yeah. So when the OSR became a thing, what was your initial impressions?
I thought it was brilliant. I felt vindicated because I had graduated to AD&D. Like all my friends wanted to play AD&D, and we all played that. And I couldn't. At one point, I was like, I think it'd be better to just go back to a simpler version of the game, play regular D&D. And they were like, no, that's for babies. And then when I started looking at OSR stuff, like when the OSR started hitting in the early 2000s, and I started looking at stuff like Bornheim or Maze of the Blue Medusa, I was like, oh, wow, this is fantastic. Like this is so much more innovative and creative. And it's still that way. All the best stuff that I like Halls of the Blood King by Diogo Nogueira. Just a brilliant module. It's all old school stuff. I just read, I'm reading some Lamentations of Flame Princess stuff now. And, I just read J.P. Couvert's Dragon Town, and it's got a very old school vibe. And it's just like, let's just scale it back and have fewer rules because we could play more game in less time. It's just so much more creative. That's my opinion.
I agree with that for sure. You need just enough rules to have a framework so that, a language that everybody can agree upon. And then the rest of it's just you and your friends around the table telling a story together, which is great. So you've been a dungeon master, a game master for a long, long time. And I'm sure that you have some stories that are very rewarding or memorable or have you. Like what are some of your most favorite or most rewarding dungeon master stories?
My favorite stories are when I thought up an adventure in 15 minutes and then everybody said it was the greatest adventure of all time. And it's happened more than once. And I've learned the hard way that the amount of time you spend prepping the game is not in any way commensurate to the amount of fun people are going to have, which is not to say you shouldn't prep a game. You should. However, you probably shouldn't over prep because it won't improve things.
Why do you think it is that you can spend 15 minutes, and I don't recommend doing that, you can spend 15 minutes prepping for a game and the players think it's just the best adventure of all time?
So it all has to do with the players and what they bring to the table. So the missing element, for a lot of game masters is like they think it's all about them and their world and their story and it's all on them. It isn't. It's the players. And sometimes they bring their A game and sometimes they bring their C game and they're just phoning it in. And it's a lot like teaching a class, right? So I'm an English teacher by trade, and I will teach the same lesson to several different classes. And I've noticed something. I'll notice one class has a great time and they think it's just so much fun. And I think it goes great. And then I run for a different class, totally different reaction. It's like pulling teeth. And that's because one group brought their A game and then the other group is just, phoning it in. And sometimes you got players who are really into the game and they take an active role. They're active participants and they want to make the game better and bring their creativity to it. And then some players, it's either an off night or you get the players that think it's like a movie and you're there to entertain them and things should just happen and it doesn't click. And the great sessions, the one you remember, are the ones where everything just clicks and it's just all in sync. And the game master alone does not bring that to the table. They can't. And that's where the magic happens.
That's true. One of my groups still brings up to this day in the 5th edition game I was running. I had a Mind Flayer encounter, Mind Flayer and his minions. And he happened to be, I used some map out of probably one of Mike J's products or whatever. Like, okay, I need a map for this area. We'll use this. Well, I just so happened to have a pool in the room. And one of the players was a druid. And he transformed into an octopus and commenced to grapple the Mind Flayer and everything and basically subdue him on his own. And the players remember that. Like, that was not my plan. Like, the map was, I think it was the last minute decision, and it's one of the most memorable moments of that entire group. Because, they're really impressed with how clever they were, right? Like, so.
Yeah, that it just can't be planned. I remember one time I had a group of, I often run several groups at once, and these were guys in their 20s. And one of my older players, Gene, who just passed sadly, but he had nothing to do, so he just sits in the game. And these guys were a roaming band of mercenaries. They had an adventure where one of them, the guy's son was like an evil chaos lord. And they finally face off, this guy against his son, on the top of this tower. And they get ready to face off, and one of the players says, look, I'm not going to fight you. You're my son. I love you. And he throws down his sword. And I said, well, he's going to cut your head off. And the guy goes, well, don't I get a roll, like, to persuade him or something? I'm like, okay, I'll give you a roll. He rolls a natural 20. So I said, okay, your son, the evil chaos lord, throws down his weapon, and I think he killed the bad guy and flung himself off the tower. And my older player, Gene, was like, what is happening? This is the weirdest game of all time. And instead of this massive battle on top of a tower, it was like a father and son reunited. And all the rest of the guys are like cheering, yay! And it's just like, you can't plan those things.
That's amazing. I may have heard you tell that story before, but it's great to get it on my channel, folks. It's the power of role playing games in storytelling. So, speaking of storytelling, you being an English teacher, you are well read, versed in many forms of media, and of course, I know that media influences your DM style and your philosophy and everything like that. So what books, media or other types of events have transformed your DM style?
I really like the books of Robert Howard and Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber was such a huge influence on like the type of games I like. And I take influence from everything I read. But obviously Lord of the Rings, which I'm rereading now. The classic fantasy stuff for people like my age. And as far as media, I always loved this movie. It's a French film, The Brotherhood of the Wolf, and it really informs my games. It was like kind of like the vibe of my game, and it's sort of, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's sort of, I describe it as it's the best kung fu werewolf whodunit political intrigue costume drama you've ever seen, and I like that movie a lot. I like Conan the Barbarian a lot. But all media, all action films and stuff have really influenced me. One of the things that I've always noticed about films that are really tense is they have time limits. And that's something that very few Game Master sections ever talk about. They talk about the location, which is important. They talk about what's in the location, the villain and the enemy. That's important. And traps. They don't talk about time limits. So that's one of the things that I talk about on my channel. It's going to be in my game, Deathbringer. Time limits are critically important. They're one of the things that can elevate a game from an average game to a really outstanding one.
That's true. I've seen that in my own experience. She uses it more often than I actually do. But yeah, it's great. So you've been running a Dungeons and Dragons campaign for over 30 years now. Yep. When people hear that, a lot of people, their first question is, how? Let's talk about that for a little bit. How does a D&D campaign of over 30 years work?
So it actually evolved from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay like for people are always asking like, well, is this system compatible with this system? And I think all systems are compatible because it started as Warhammer. Then when third edition came out, we moved it to third edition. Then that was too sloggy, so we turned it to like Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Then we changed it into XDM and Tracy Hickman's XDM, and it gradually morphed into what is now Deathbringer. So it's gone through 5 or 6 different game systems. We actually tried Dungeon World for a little while. So it's about 5, 6 game systems. And the game system is not important to my players or me. It's the characters. The characters remain the same. And they're deep characters. It's not just about like the power they are. Because everyone asks what level they are after 30 years. And it's like level 7, because, high level play, it's just not that interesting to my players and I. And the key to having a campaign that lasts that long is we don't play every single week, and we're older, so we don't get together. We might not get together for a couple months. But the key is I never plan the session more than one session ahead. And I always give my best stuff in that next session because I don't know if we're going to play again. And I don't know if my players are going to want to play again. I never take it as a given that I'm going to design a big giant quest. And they'll sit with me every Friday night for a year to play it. I don't treat a game that way. I'm like, okay, we're going to play one time. And if you like it, when you start asking me for another session, then I'll run one. And that's how it's lasted that long, by not planning ahead.
I know that's going to be a new teaching for some people. So if you happen to be under the age of 30 and actually watching this video, because I know my demographics, that's unlikely, but anyway, follow this advice. One session at a time, make it great. I used to think that way. It's like, the Age of Worms campaign from Dungeon Magazine.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, I got this is so great. I got to run this whole thing. And we got up to about level 13 before, life got in the way. That was like the last time that I had my heart set on running an entire campaign from the beginning to the end that was going to last over a year. But still, I still hadn't really thought, okay, one session at a time until, encountered your YouTube channel, which, by the way, I'll keep this in. So let me tell you what my first impression of the Dungeon Craft YouTube channel was.
Sure thing.
I saw this guy dressed up who resembled Keith Olbermann in my eyes, right? Talking about Dungeons and Dragons, calling himself Professional Dungeon Master. And I felt like, well, this guy thinks he's really important. Who is this guy, right? I'm not going to check his channel out. Then Mike Shea mentioned you on his channel, and I forget what it was. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was one of those types of things that was counter to what modern role-playing philosophy is. And then when so I watched it, I'm like, all right, that's a good point, but guys still kind of highfalutin. And then as my taste morphed and changed, you started to grow on me, and to the point where it's like right now, you're my favorite dungeon tuber. By far, it's not even close, because a lot of my philosophies line up with yours and how I look at role playing games and in general and everything like that. But I just thought it was funny because it's first impressions are kind of funny like that.
Well, I'm glad you stuck it out, and it's very flattering because many of my Dungeon Tuber colleagues are very, very talented people, and I love their channels. I love so many other channels, and it's nice when someone says I'm their favorite. That's very flattering.
Thank you. So you mentioned XDM, Extreme Dungeon Mastery, and you've covered that book on your channel. What's that about? I know that you have a very high opinion of it. Why is that?
I played games with Tracy Hickman years ago at Gen Con, and I was amazed that the way he ran the game, which is just, I'm going to tell you what to roll on a 20-sided die, and you're going to roll it. And he eventually came out with this book, Extreme Dungeon Mastery, in the early 2000s, around 2000 to 2004. And it's all his best ideas on how to run games. And a lot of it has to do with identifying the types of your players and trying to cater the game to them, right? And their particular wants and needs and personalities. But also, he's got a system, which is really simple. It's 3 ability scores. And it all comes down to just rolling a 20-sided die and trying to meet or beat the target number. You don't have to get into the weeds about exactly what your character is carrying. And, in a magic system, breaking down a magic system into, little bite-sized pieces. Just get on with the game and strip it down and simplify it. And that was mind-blowing to me because I always loved his stuff. I always loved Ravenloft and Dragonlance, obviously. He also did great stuff for Top Secret SI. And
I didn't know that.
He had an adventure on a nuclear submarine that contained actual nuclear submarine plans. Like it was like crazy over the top. It was a box set thing. I just think he was the greatest designer. And here he is saying, actually, we don't actually play Dungeons & Dragons that way. We don't play weapon speed factors. We don't even, we don't stop to look up a spell. That's not the way it's done. The way the designers play. My feeling was, okay, I got to strip my game back and do that. And once I did that, it became so much easier to plan. And the whole idea that, well, I like this IP, but it doesn't, like G.I. Joe, but it doesn't have a role-playing game. Or maybe G.I. Joe does. Does G.I. Joe have a role-playing game?
Yes, it does.
Okay, it does. All right.
It's a D&D-ish game.
Yeah. Okay, I want to play Teletubbies, the role-playing game, but, that's not an IP. Or, yeah. I'm trying to think of a better. Thundar the Barbarian. I want to be Thundar the Barbarian. Or Thundercats. There's no role-playing game for that. You can play that. You can make it up yourself. You roll a 20-sided die, and Lino does, whatever. How easy is it to hit Lino to hit Mumra? Yeah, it's about an 8. Lino's pretty powerful. Let's just move on with it. You just don't need all the systems that we have. Now, it's still cool to read systems,
right.
But it's not a necessary thing. I appreciate the art of systems. Like I'm reading, what is it now? There's just so many of them. I'm reading a new Cyberpunk game and the vampire game. What's that one? Eat the Reich. And I'm like, these books are so cool, and I'm really into it. But systems, you don't have to be just totally, okay, we have to follow the system exactly the way it's written, slow the process down. That's why XDM really blew my mind.
It's amazing. I have the second edition. I know what you don't really have time to review and everything like that. But folks, subscribers, listeners to this podcast, if you want me to do a review of XDM second edition, I'd be more than happy to because I have it and I've enjoyed it as well. As a matter of fact, Professor Dungeon Master is the reason why there is a Extreme Dungeon Master 2E, because when he did his review of the first, people went looking for it, either buying electronic version like I did, or getting it second hand. And Tracy Hickman was like, "Well," and I don't blame him. Good for him. Yeah,
that resurrected his game.
Yes, this is a good transition as any. So you have a channel that's been around for several years and over 100,000 subscribers and everything like that. And I know they have other things aside from just the YouTube channel. But it makes you a very busy man. What does that workflow look like?
I'm going to give you my week. So this time last week, I was at Mace in North Carolina. I got back from Mace on Sunday. Monday, I had off for Veterans Day. Thank you for all the veterans who served. And I spent the day working on Dungeon Craft videos, editing Dungeon Craft videos. Tuesday I went back to work. I'm working as a full-time teacher. Wednesday, my Dungeon Master's Guide arrived. So Wednesday and Tuesday is lesson planning, grading tons of student papers, and writing recommendations. Wednesday, the Dungeon Master's Guide comes in, and I spent the next 2 evenings writing a review of the new Dungeon Master's Guide. Last night, I did some painting with a group that I volunteer with, Hero's Journey, here in New Jersey. It provides role-playing game opportunities and miniatures and rules to kids. So I spent the evening painting with kids. I spent Thursday painting with my buddy Adhesive Tom. And this morning I woke up, I taped an episode of Dungeon Craft because I have written it. I'd written the review and I realized I was out of focus. The stone wall was in focus, but my face wasn't in focus. So I'm going to have to tape it again. And then once I tape it again, which is after your show, I have to edit it and then put in the B-roll. And by the time I do that, it will be dark. And then tomorrow I'll spend writing my game Deathbringer, which I'm working on. And then Monday I go back to work again. So one of the things you'll never hear me say is I watched a show on TV or I watched a game on TV. Like I don't have time for that. I never do that. So something has to go. And that's what it is. I just got rid of television. And but that's how I generally work. I'll start scripting an episode early in the week, and I'll tape it Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. If I can rush home and tape it Wednesday or Thursday and just edit it, I might have a Saturday semi-free in which, I'll paint models or something. But I do dungeon craft every day, even holidays.
Wow, that's a lot. You got to do something if you want to have a successful YouTube channel, or really any other kind of creative endeavor. Like
Yeah.
It's a second job. You got my respect for sure. Yeah. So you mentioned it, and I was going to ask you about it. You're making a game called Deathbringer. How did that come about, and how is it going?
So it came about because all my viewers and patrons said, "We want a game. We want your house rules. What are they?" And I'm like, "Okay, well, I've got to write them up, I guess." And then we put out the trifold, the difold version of Deathbringer, which is designed by Hanker and Fernale, Brandish Gillum of Runehammer, and he's a fan and patron. And he's like, "Your character sheet sucks. I'm gonna make a good one." And then he made a character sheet, and then he wrote up all the rules, and we put it up, and it's been a bestseller at RPG, Drive Through RPG, for like 2 years now. And then we're going to expand it into a full game. Now that should seem easy, but it's a struggle because it's amazing how complex a very simple game can be. And at this point, I just finished a draft and I gave it to one of the co-writers is James Spahn, who wrote the One Ring starter set, which I know you're a fan of the One Ring.
Yep.
James has a copy of it. He's going through it. He's already written. I wrote a draft. He wrote a draft. We batted him back and forth. And he's working on the next draft now. But I still work on it. Like I still work on little bits and pieces. Like, okay, I'm going to add a monster or a personality, an NPC personality. And for those of you that don't know what Deathbringer is, imagine Dungeons and Dragons, but instead of you having a character sheet, you have a pool of 6-sided dice. And those are all your spells and feats and powers. And when you want to do something cool, you spend those dice to add to a D20 roll. And then as the game goes on, you have fewer and fewer. That is what Deathbringer is.
That is interesting. Like I've other versions, a couple of versions of Deathbringer and everything like that. And I know that it's evolved as things do in development. You're doing all of this, and you have this job. You're a teacher, and that's a lot of work in and of itself.
Yeah.
There's other people like, Kelsey Dion of Arcane Library, who made this excellent game, Shadowdark, but she was already writing adventures. So, like, she was already being a RPG creative as a full-time thing. And so her game was like a few years of development, and she was already full time in the industry. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yep.
So I can't wait to see what the final result's going to look like. But I know that you think it's going to be a little bit more down the line, right? Like
it's I'll tell you exactly what it's going to look like after this interview is done. But it's going to be different. It's going to be different, and it's something that hasn't been seen in role-playing games in a long time. Although it is a variant of Dungeons & Dragons still.
Right. And let's talk about your philosophy about Dungeons & Dragons, because you made a video that I think was very, very good, titled, "It's All D&D to Me." Like, what is that about?
So you said earlier that Dungeons & Dragons is a language, and I agree. And languages have variants and dialects. So if you're learning Spanish in school, you think there's one language called Spanish. There's not. There's like 7 or 8 different versions of Spanish, depending on where you're from. But everyone who speaks Spanish can communicate with one another. And I think that Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Tales of the Valiant, Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Shadowdark, Index Card RPG, Knave are fundamentally, at the DNA level, the same game. You're rolling a 20-sided die. You got 6 ability scores: strength, intelligence, wisdom, etc. You got armor class. You got hit points. You have a 20-sided die. You're trying to roll high and meet or beat a target number. If you do it, there's going to be an effect that occurs. That is the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons. So you're just playing a variant, and that's cool. And the reason why it's so popular is because it's brilliant. It's the Arnis Gygax design is brilliant. It can't be beat for simplicity and ease of use. And that's why it's lasted so long.
So what coming down the line for Professor Dungeon Master and the Dungeon Craft YouTube channel?
So getting Deathbringer out there, and that's going to take still more than a year. what are we in November of 2024? It's going to take
November. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to take still some time. You won't see it in 2025 because it's got to be done right. And I'm also teaching now. My teaching career is winding down. I'll be retiring, not soon, but probably around the same time it kickstarts. So I'm making a transition. I'm not leaving. I don't think of it as leaving teaching because I'm still teaching. I'm just doing it on YouTube and I'm doing it at conventions. I love going to conventions and doing talks and running events. That's what I'm going to be focusing on. I'm transitioning to just going to conventions and that being my full-time job and just making sure Deathbringer is like as cool as it could be. You know, that's if I wanted to just hire a ghostwriter to throw it out there, it would have been out already. But I want to make sure it's cool. And as far as running the channel goes, you know, I just crank out videos. Like every week I do at least one. Sometimes I do up to 3 and I just carpet bomb. And it's all about just, I don't want to say quantity over quality because I try to maintain a standard of quality, but just keeping the channel going. You know, the channel promotes the Patreon. The Patreon gives me the funds I need to fund Deathbringer. And then it's all those things together. Like I wouldn't stop YouTube because Deathbringer's coming out. I'm going to keep doing it. Just making, weekly content.
So finally, before we get out of here, I have one more question I'd like to ask all my guests on my podcast. So, Professor Dungeon Master, what is something interesting about you that people may not know about?
So I am an English teacher. I teach English, high school English, advanced placement, and English for English language learners. All right, so I teach all different levels of English, especially testing grades. So I'm like a testing guy to prep students for AP tests and SATs, PSATs, and state exams. That's what I do.
It's great that you do that. Like I consider that a form of service. I mean, teaching is in general, but that especially. So cool.
Yeah, the amount of teaching that I do, I don't think most people are aware of that. And it's like I have 120, 150 students. I got to read all their papers and stuff like that and do very high stakes testing. So maybe I'll have a second channel about how to do SP tests. I'll probably have how to beat an AP test. That's the other thing I'm good at.
To wrap this up, I want to thank you once again for coming on my channel. Where can we find you?
So you can find me on YouTube. Dungeon Craft has a Facebook group. Dungeon Craft has a presence on X. Dungeon Craft has a Patreon where you can get tons of extra bonus content. You can get Deathbringer at Drive-Thru RPG. And thanks for having me on, Ron. I really appreciate it.
Once again, thank you for being on. And this was the Ron Talks Tabletop Podcast. And until next time, see you later.